Daniel Carter was not the kind of man people noticed. He was quiet, polite, and always kept to himself. He owned a small auto repair shop in town, fixing cars with steady hands and a sharp mind. Customers liked him because he was honest and hardworking. He never overcharged, never made excuses, and always did his best. Despite his calm nature, there was something about him, something that made people respect him without knowing why. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, like a man who had seen more than he talked about. Maybe it was the way he observed everything, listening more than he spoke. But no one ever asked, and Daniel never offered to tell. Most people in town were friendly, but like every place, there were always a few who caused trouble. A small group of young men, led by Travis Malone, had gained a reputation for being reckless. They liked to act tough, especially when they thought no one could stop them. They spent their nights drinking, racing cars, and looking for easy targets. To them, Daniel seemed like just another quiet man, someone who wouldn't fight back. One evening, as Daniel locked up his shop and walked home, Travis and his friends sat outside a gas station, laughing loudly. They watched him pass by and exchanged glances. "That guy owns the repair shop, right?" one of them asked. Travis smirked. "Yeah, he's got expensive tools in there. Easy money." They convinced themselves that Daniel was weak, that he wouldn't do anything if they took what they wanted. After all, he was just a mechanic, an older man with no one to back him up. They had stolen before, cars, bikes, even from local stores, but never from a person like Daniel. To them, it was just another night of fun. At midnight, when the streets were empty, Travis and his friends broke into Daniel's shop. They smashed the lock and slipped inside, laughing as they grabbed expensive tools, cash from the register, and anything else that looked valuable. One of them knocked over a toolbox, scattering wrenches and screwdrivers across the floor. Another sprayed graffiti on the garage door, leaving behind a crude message. Before leaving, Travis looked around, then took out a piece of paper. With a grin, he wrote a note and pinned it to the workbench. It was a challenge, daring Daniel to do something about what they had done. They walked out, disappearing into the night, thinking they had won. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his shop as usual. The moment he saw the broken door, the mess inside, and the note on his workbench, he stopped. He didn't get angry. He didn't panic. Instead, he took a deep breath, picked up the note, and read it. Then he set it down carefully, his expression unreadable. The men who did this thought they had chosen an easy target. They had no idea how wrong they were. Daniel stood in the middle of his wreck shop, looking at the mess around him. Tools were scattered everywhere. The cash drawer was empty, and a spray-painted message covered the wall. He didn't move for a long time. He just observed, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. Then he picked up the note left behind by the thieves. It was meant to mock him, to make him feel helpless. But Daniel didn't feel helpless. He felt something else, something quiet and cold. He folded the note, placed it on the counter, and began cleaning up. As he worked, his mind was busy. He thought about the footprints near the door, the angle of the spray paint, the missing items. Whoever had done this wasn't smart enough to cover their tracks. They had been careless, thinking no one would figure them out. That was their mistake. By the time the shop was back in order, Daniel already had a plan. He wasn't going to call the police. He knew how things worked in a small town. By the time authorities did anything, the thieves would have spent the money, sold the tools, and laughed about it. No, Daniel had a different way of handling things. He locked up the shop and started walking through town. His steps were slow, but his mind was sharp. He knew the kind of people who did this. They liked to brag. They liked to show off. And sure enough, it didn't take long before he found a clue. At a small diner, a group of young men sat at a corner booth, laughing loudly. Daniel didn't need to hear the words to know what they were talking about. He saw it in their faces, the thrill of getting away with something. One of them, a tall guy with a leather jacket, pulled out a stack of cash, and waved it around. The others cheered. Daniel stepped inside, keeping his distance. He ordered a coffee and sat at the counter, listening. The young men were careless. They talked too much, too loudly. "Easiest job ever," one of them said, stuffing money into his pocket. That old guy probably cried when he saw his shop. Daniel took a slow sip of his coffee. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was just patient. The leader of the group, Travis, leaned forward. "Don't get too comfortable," he warned his friends. "We need to lay low for a while. That guy might call the cops." One of the others laughed. "What's he gonna do? He's just some nobody fixing cars." Daniel set his coffee down. They thought he was a nobody. They had no idea who they had messed with. Without a word, he finished his drink, paid his bill, and walked out of the diner. He had heard everything he needed. Now, it was time to make his move. Daniel walked home with a calm expression, but inside, his mind was working like a machine. He now knew exactly who had robbed his shop. He had seen their faces, heard their words, and understood what kind of people they were. They thought they had won. They thought he was weak. That was their second mistake. Once home, Daniel sat down at his old wooden desk. He didn't need a computer or fancy equipment. He just needed a notepad, a pen, and his memory. He wrote down everything he had observed. The way they talked, the way they dressed, and even the way they moved. These details told him more than words ever could. Then he made a list. Travis Malone, leader, overconfident, cautious but not careful enough. Eric Dawson, talks too much, easily distracted. Jake Miller, reckless, tries to act tough. Connor Reese, follows orders, weakest link. Daniel tapped the pen against the paper, thinking. These men had no discipline, no strategy. They acted on impulse, believing no one could stop them. That was their third mistake. The next step was simple. He needed to make them feel what they had done, but not through anger or violence. That wasn't his way. No, Daniel believed in something more powerful, fear and doubt. The first target was Connor, the weakest link. Late that night, when the town was quiet, Daniel made his move. He had lived in this town for years. He knew its streets, its shortcuts, and the places where shadows hid everything. It took him less than 10 minutes to reach Connor's house. The front yard was dark, the house silent. Connor was asleep, unaware of what was coming. Daniel didn't break in. He didn't need to. Instead, he carefully placed a single wrench on the front porch, one of the stolen tools from his shop. Then, using a marker, he wrote on a piece of cardboard, "I see everything." He left the note next to the wrench and walked away, unseen. The next morning, Connor woke up early, stretching as he opened the door to get some fresh air. Then he froze. His eyes locked onto the wrench, the note beside it. His hand started to shake as he picked it up. His mind raced. How? Who? Had Daniel been here? Had he seen them? Connor grabbed his phone and called Travis. "Dude," he whispered, looking around nervously. "Something's wrong. Someone was at my house." Travis sighed. "What are you talking about?" "There's a wrench from the shop. And a note." For the first time, Travis didn't have a smart reply. Instead, a strange feeling crept into his chest. A feeling he wasn't used to. Uncertainty. They thought it was over. But it was just beginning. Travis stared at his phone, listening to Connor's shaky voice. The fear in his tone was obvious. Travis had never heard him like this before. "Calm down," Travis said, though he felt uneasy himself. "It's probably a coincidence. Maybe you left the wrench there." Connor swallowed hard. "No way, man. I never took anything home." And the note. Someone was here. Someone knows. Travis rubbed his forehead, thinking. The job at the repair shop was supposed to be easy. They had done it quickly and left no witnesses, or so they thought. But now, something didn't feel right. "All right," Travis finally said. "Meet me at the spot. Bring the wrench." Half an hour later, Travis, Eric, Jake, and Connor met behind an old warehouse, their usual hangout. Connor placed the wrench and note on the ground. The others leaned in, reading the words again. "I see everything." Jake scoffed. "So what? The old man's trying to scare us. Big deal." Eric nodded, smirking. "Yeah, what's he gonna do? Call the cops? We took care of that place in minutes. He's probably just mad." Connor wasn't convinced. "Then how did this wrench get on my porch? How did he even find my house?" That was the question that made them all go silent. Travis clenched his jaw. "Listen up. No one panics. We don't talk about this to anyone. We lay low for a few days, and it'll blow over." But even as he said the words, Travis didn't believe them. Meanwhile, Daniel was already planning his next move. He knew Connor would be the first to break, and from the phone call he overheard, yes, he had tapped into their conversation. His plan was working. They were doubting themselves. That was the first step. That night, Daniel visited Eric's house, just like before. He didn't break in. He didn't need to. He found Eric's car parked outside, covered in dust from his careless driving. Daniel pulled a small cloth from his pocket and wiped a single fingerprint-sized circle on the driver's side window. Then he placed another wrench, this one a little closer to the front door. The message was clear. "I can get close. Anytime. Anywhere." The next morning, Eric stretched and yawned as he stepped outside. He was about to unlock his car when he stopped. His eyes narrowed. A perfectly clean circle was wiped on his window, right at eye level. Eric's stomach twisted. His hands felt sweaty as he took a step back. Then he saw it. Another wrench on the porch. He didn't need to read a note this time. The message was loud and clear. Eric ran to his phone and dialed Travis. "Dude," he whispered, his voice shaking. It happened again. Now, even Travis wasn't sure what to believe. Daniel wasn't just watching them. He was already inside their world. And they had no way out. Travis stood outside the warehouse, gripping his phone tightly. His friends were losing their nerve, and it was starting to make him uneasy. First Connor, now Eric. They were both shaken, acting like ghosts had visited them in the night. But Travis wasn't the kind of guy to believe in ghosts. He believed in logic, in facts. Still, the facts weren't making sense. Someone had left a wrench on Connor's porch. Someone had wiped a perfect circle on Eric's car window. Someone was watching them, and getting closer. Travis took a deep breath and called a meeting. An hour later, they all gathered at the same warehouse. Connor and Eric looked pale, their usual arrogance replaced by fear. Jake, still trying to act tough, kicked at the dirt. Travis looked at them carefully. "We don't panic," he said firmly. "It's just some old man trying to scare us." Eric shook his head. "Then how does he know where we live?" Connor swallowed hard. "What if he's been following us? What if he's watching right now?" Jake scoffed. "Come on, man. You're acting like he's some kind of." Suddenly, a loud metallic bang echoed from outside the warehouse. All four of them froze. Jake spun around, his heart pounding. What was that? No one answered. For a long moment, the group stood completely still, barely breathing. Then Travis clenched his fists and forced a laugh. "It's nothing. Just the wind." But he didn't believe that. Slowly, he walked to the warehouse door and pushed it open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a chill down his spine. He stepped outside, scanning the area. The alley was empty. The street was quiet. Then he saw it. Right in front of the warehouse entrance, placed neatly on the ground. Another wrench. No note this time. No extra message. Just the wrench. Travis's breath caught in his throat. His pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't a game anymore. This was personal. He snatched the wrench and turned back to the others. "We need to do something," he said, his voice low. "We need to make sure this guy never messes with us again." Eric and Connor didn't respond. Jake hesitated but then nodded. "What do you want to do?" Jake asked. Travis's jaw tightened. "We're going to pay him a visit. Tonight." Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his shop, sipping a cup of coffee. He knew what they were planning. He had been expecting it. He set his cup down, stood up, and checked the locks on his doors. Everything was exactly how he wanted it. Because tonight, they weren't coming for him. He was waiting for them. The night was cold and silent as Travis and his crew moved through the empty streets. Their plan was simple: go to Daniel's shop, confront him, and make sure he never messed with them again. At least, that's what Travis told them. Deep down, even he wasn't sure what they were walking into. Every part of his body told him something was wrong, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He had to prove he was in control. They reached the repair shop just after midnight. The lights were off. The street was empty. It looked like any other night. Travis nodded at Jake. "Check the door." Jake stepped forward, testing the handle. It was unlocked. Connor shifted nervously. "This feels like a trap." Travis shot him a glare. "Don't be stupid. He's just an old mechanic. What's he gonna do?" Eric swallowed. "Then why does it feel like he's expecting us?" Travis ignored him and pushed the door open. The shop was dark, except for a single hanging light in the middle of the room. Shadows stretched across the walls, making everything look bigger than it was. They stepped inside carefully, their footsteps echoing. Then they saw it. On the workbench, lined up perfectly, were 4 wrenches, one for each of them. Connor let out a shaky breath. "No way? How did he?" Before he could finish, the garage door behind them slammed shut. The sound was deafening. Jake spun around, grabbing the handle. "It's locked." Then a voice filled the room, calm, steady, and completely in control. "You boys have made a lot of mistakes." Travis's heart pounded. He turned toward the sound. Daniel stepped forward from the shadows, his face unreadable. He wasn't holding a weapon. He wasn't angry. He just looked disappointed. "You thought I was just some nobody," Daniel continued. "You thought you could steal from me, break into my shop, and walk away like nothing happened." Eric took a shaky step back. "Look, man, we didn't." Daniel raised a hand, and Eric fell silent. "You wanted to scare me," Daniel said, "but you never asked yourselves the real question." Connor swallowed hard. What question?" Daniel's eyes met each of theirs, one by one. "What if you picked the wrong person?" Silence filled the shop. None of them spoke. None of them moved. Daniel took a step closer. And for the first time in their lives, Travis and his crew felt truly powerless. They weren't in control anymore. Daniel was. And he wasn't finished yet. The shop was completely silent. The only sound was the slow, steady ticking of a nearby clock. The 4 young men stood frozen, their backs to the locked garage door, their eyes locked on Daniel. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make them uneasy. Travis forced a smirk, trying to keep his usual confidence. "All right, old man. You got us here. What now?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked over to the workbench. Picking up one of the wrenches, he turned it in his hand, examining it as if deciding something. Then he set it back down. "You broke into my shop," he said slowly, his voice calm. "You stole from me, and you thought I wouldn't do anything about it." Jake crossed his arms. "So what? You called us here to lecture us." Daniel smiled slightly. "No, you came here on your own, because you were scared." Connor flinched at the words. He was scared. They all were, but none of them wanted to admit it. Daniel stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Not rushing, not threatening, just moving with purpose. Travis tensed, his fists clenching. If you think you can. Before he could finish, the lights flickered off. The shop was suddenly plunged into darkness. Panic spread through the group instantly. Jake stumbled back against the door. Eric let out a shaky breath. Connor whispered, "No, no, no." Then the lights flickered back on, and Daniel was gone. Travis's pulse pounded in his ears. He spun around, searching the shop. Where did he? A voice came from the shadows, right behind them. "You boys think you know fear," Daniel said softly. Travis turned sharply, but Daniel wasn't standing where he had been before. He was closer. Connor gasped and backed away. "This isn't normal. Man, let's just get out of here." Eric rattled the door handle. It's still locked. Travis gritted his teeth. He had had enough. "Enough of this game," he shouted. "Show yourself." Silence. Then, just as suddenly as before, the lights cut off again. This time, they stayed off. The shop was pitch black. Shuffling footsteps echoed from somewhere in the darkness. Then, a quiet, steady voice. "You should have never come here." A loud clang rang through the shop as something metal fell over. The sound was too close, too near. Eric's breathing turned ragged. Connor was shaking. Jake pressed his back against the wall, and Travis, who had always been so sure, so fearless, felt true fear for the first time in his life. Then, from the darkness, Daniel spoke once more. "It's time you learned what real fear feels like." The shop remained in complete darkness. The air felt heavy, thick with silence. Travis could hear the shaky breathing of his crew. Jake was muttering something under his breath. Eric kept pulling at the door handle, hoping it would somehow open. Connor stood frozen, gripping his own arms like he was trying to hold himself together. Then, Daniel's voice came again, low and steady. "I gave you a chance to walk away." The word sent a chill through Travis's body. He spun around, but there was nothing but shadows. "You didn't take it." A sudden metallic clang echoed from the other side of the shop. Eric let out a startled yelp, backing into the wall. Then a new sound. A slow, deliberate footstep. Then another. And another. Travis swallowed hard. He forced himself to stand tall. "We're not scared of you," he shouted. The footsteps stopped. Then Daniel spoke again, softer this time. "That's your final mistake." Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. But Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Instead, right in front of them, the wrenches were gone. The workbench was empty. Connor's breath hitched. This isn't normal." Jake looked around wildly. "We need to get out of here." Then, click. The garage door unlocked. For a second, no one moved. Then Eric rushed forward and yanked the door open. The cold night air hit them, and without thinking, they bolted. They didn't stop running. They didn't look back. They just ran as fast as their legs could carry them, as far from that shop as possible. It wasn't until they reached the warehouse, their safe place, that they finally stopped, panting for breath. Travis bent over, hands on his knees. His heart was still racing. He had never felt fear like that before. Never. Connor sat down on the ground, his face pale. "I don't care what anyone says. That guy isn't normal." Eric wiped the sweat from his forehead. "We messed with the wrong person." Jake, usually the tough one, didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor, shaking his head. Travis clenched his fists. He had spent his whole life acting like he was untouchable. But now, for the first time, he realized the truth. Some people aren't meant to be messed with. Some people fight back in ways you never expect. And Daniel, he wasn't just some old mechanic. He was a man that would never forget. And from that night on, none of them ever went near that shop again. Because deep down, in the back of their minds, they all knew one thing. Daniel was still watching. And if they ever made another mistake, he would be ready.